April 8th, 1943. Eastern Front, near Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The ground shakes as the rumble of artillery fire fills the frigid morning air. The German defensive positions are taking a beating as the Soviet offensive presses on relentlessly. Just as the rumblings of Soviet artillery fade for a moment, a new sound emerges. A mechanical clank, the unmistakable sound of tank treads chewing through the frozen earth. But these are not the T-34 seconds the Germans have been battling for months. These are different. Bulkier, heavier, but as formidable as any panzer. Lieutenant Friedrich Müller of the 6th Panzer Division peers through his binoculars, his breath fogging in the cold air. The Soviet assault had been brutal, but the sight of these strange machines causes his heart to skip a beat. At first, he mistakes them for Soviet tanks, but something is wrong. They move slower, heavier, but with unrelenting precision. Their thick armor and firepower give them an unmistakable presence on the battlefield. These are no ordinary Soviet tanks. These are American tanks. Specifically, the M3 Lee. The first battle with the M3 Lee is chaotic. The Germans, already engaged in a bitter fight with the Soviet forces, are blindsided by the appearance of these new tanks. Their first impression is disbelief. The M3 is an unusual design, top-heavy, with a turret that resembles something out of a different war. But it's not the design that catches the Germans off guard. It's the performance. The American tanks, with their 75mm guns and thick armor, proved to be far more resilient than expected. The Germans try to strike with their own Panzer IVs and even the mighty Tiger I, but the M3 Lee seems unyielding. When they hit it, it keeps moving. When the Germans try to disable it with artillery, it continues its advance. For Lieutenant Müller, it's a cold, sobering realization this is not a one-off. This is the beginning of something bigger. As the Soviet forces use these American tanks to push forward, Müller feels a knot form in his stomach. The Germans, masters of armored warfare, have been caught off guard. This new weapon, which they never anticipated, is now part of the battlefield. The initial shock of encountering the M3 Lee gives way to an even deeper concern. If the United States could produce this many tanks and supply them to the Soviet Union, the Germans were facing something they couldn't beat, an industrial powerhouse capable of churning out war machines faster than they could destroy them. The first clash with the M3 Lee isn't just a tactical surprise. It's a clear signal. The United States isn't just sending a few tanks to the front lines, they're sending an industrial juggernaut. And the Germans, who had long relied on their own technological superiority, are about to face a new kind of war, one where the numbers alone may decide the outcome. The Germans had underestimated the scale of America's involvement. Now, they were starting to pay the price. April 25th, 1943, Southern Russia. The skies are heavy with smoke as Soviet artillery continues to pound German positions. Lieutenant Müller, along with his fellow officers, watches from the front lines as Soviet tanks roll forward once again this time, with an even more daunting presence. The M3 Lee was only the beginning. Now, the M4 Sherman tanks are being deployed in increasing numbers. As they appear on the horizon, a grim realization sets in. The tide is turning in favor of the Allies, and it's not just the Soviet will to fight, it's the sheer force of America's production. Müller has seen the devastation these new American tanks can cause. The M3 Lee, though awkward in design, was merely a preview. The M4 Sherman, more refined and better suited for combat, takes the battlefield by storm. It is faster, more maneuverable, and above all, far easier to produce in massive numbers. The first battle against the M4 Sherman leaves no room for doubt the Germans can't keep up. The realization sinks in at all levels of the German command. Major General Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group South, assembles his officers in a hastily arranged meeting. The map on the table in front of them tells the story. The Soviet advance is no longer something that can be checked by a few tactical victories. The relentless American tanks are making it more and more difficult to hold ground. At the meeting, von Manstein's face is grim. He knew that the German industry had always been able to produce advanced weaponry, but that had been a different war. The reality was now clear. The United States wasn't just supplying tanks, they were flooding the battlefield with them. Each time the Germans disabled one tank, two more appeared in its place. They could no longer rely on technological superiority alone. They were fighting an industrial war, one that Germany could not sustain. The M4 Sherman was not a perfect machine. It lacked the heavy armor of the Tiger I and the firepower of the Panther. But it was enough. The Germans had underestimated the simplicity and effectiveness of the design. The Sherman was a versatile tank, able to be repaired and replaced quickly in the field. The Germans were used to focusing on high-tech weapons, but now their enemies had mastered the art of mass production, and as more Shermans arrived on the front lines, the Germans began to realize that their own tanks, despite their superior technology, were becoming obsolete. The shift in the battlefield dynamic was stark. Major Wilhelm Kessler of the 6th Panzer Division watched as yet another American column of Shermans moved past his position, reinforcing the Soviet push. He thought back to earlier days, when German tanks had rolled across Europe with unmatched might. Now, it was as if the Allies had found a way to negate that advantage. No longer was it a battle of innovation and tactical genius. It was now a battle of who could keep up with the relentless pace of war production. It wasn't just the M4 Sherman's firepower or armor that posed a threat. It was the unyielding wave of tanks, infantry, and supplies that kept coming. Kessler understood it now. Germany's war effort was being strangled not just by Soviet firepower, but by the overwhelming industrial machine the United States had unleashed. Back in the German High Command, von Manstein's assessment echoed in the minds of every officer. If the Americans could keep up this pace of production, they could outlast the Germans, no matter how advanced their own weapons were. The Soviets weren't simply benefiting from Lend-Lease, they were getting a steady stream of tanks, ammunition, and supplies, giving them the edge that the Germans couldn't match. It wasn't a question of firepower anymore. It was a question of logistics, of raw numbers. And the Germans, for all their technological prowess, had no answer to that. The Germans had now entered a new phase of the war, one where industrial might and production capacity would play as significant a role as the weapons themselves. The M4 Sherman had proven this, and as it continued to flood the battlefield, it drove home a bitter truth. The Germans were fighting not just the Soviet Union, but the combined might of American industry. May 12, 1943. Near Kursk, Soviet Union, the German forces, bolstered by elite units and the might of their powerful tanks like the Tiger I, have been preparing for a decisive counteroffensive. But as dawn breaks over the snow-covered plains of Eastern Europe, the ground vibrates with the sound of rumbling tanks, and these are not the familiar German machines. The American Lend-Lease tanks have arrived in full force. Lieutenant Müller, now exhausted from the constant battles and struggling to keep his men in high spirits, watches as a line of M4 Shermans emerges from the Soviet lines, moving steadily towards the German defenses. His heart sinks. These tanks, which had once seemed like a mere nuisance in the distance, now seem unstoppable. The relentless supply of Shermans, each one arriving in waves, begins to change the course of battle. The German strategy had been built around tactical brilliance and superior technology, but the sheer numbers of American tanks rendered those advantages meaningless. As Soviet artillery pounds German positions, Müller and his comrades brace for the inevitable push. It is no longer a battle of skill, but of endurance. The Germans can destroy individual tanks, but the supply line is endless, and every tank destroyed is immediately replaced by another. The Soviet forces, now equipped with an overwhelming number of M4 Shermans, push forward with unprecedented force. General von Manstein's worst fears are becoming reality. The Soviet offensive is no longer just a fight against enemy soldiers or tanks, it's a war of attrition, where the Germans cannot keep up. The Lend-Lease tanks have not only provided the Soviets with much-needed firepower, they've given them a logistical edge that Germany simply cannot match. The factories in the United States continue to churn out these tanks in staggering numbers, while German factories, already under constant Allied bombing raids, struggle to maintain production. In a tense meeting with his staff, von Manstein lays out the grim reality. The industrial war that the Germans had always feared is now upon them. No matter how well trained their soldiers are, or how powerful their advanced tanks like the Tiger or Panther may be, the Germans cannot win a war of numbers. The Allies have the resources, the supply chains, and the production capacity to overwhelm the German military, and the M4 Sherman is the face of this shift. The German commanders are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The United States' industrial capacity is not just an advantage, it's a game changer. The speed and scale at which the U.S. military can produce tanks, planes, and other war materials mean that even if they suffer losses on the battlefield, the Allies can replace their losses in days, if not hours. Meanwhile, the Germans, already spread thin across multiple fronts, cannot replicate this level of output. Major Kessler, once optimistic that Germany's tactical superiority could overcome any challenge, now watches helplessly as the Soviet forces surge forward, their M4 Shermans leading the charge. The realization settles in, like a cold weight on his chest. The German war machine, designed for speed and precision, is being crushed by the unrelenting force of American industrial power. The Soviet forces, equipped with M4 Shermans, are now able to absorb losses and keep coming. The Germans can only retreat or fight, neither of which offers any hope of victory. The Americans have not only supplied tanks, they have provided a blueprint for total war. The M4 Sherman is not just a tank, it's a symbol of a strategy that Germany cannot match. The Americans, with their massive production lines and ability to replace losses at an exponential rate, are changing the nature of the war. It's not about better weapons. It's about who can keep up with the endless supply of arms, equipment, and vehicles. Müller's unit has already lost dozens of tanks in the past few days, and it's clear that they cannot continue to fight a war of attrition with the Allies. The Germans were never prepared for this type of warfare. They had counted on their technological edge and tactical superiority to win the war, but now, with the constant supply of American tanks flooding the battlefield, that edge is slipping away. The Germans are fighting not just against the Soviet forces, they are fighting against an unstoppable industrial machine. The thought crosses Müller's mind as he watches another wave of M4 Shermans advance, their engines roaring across the landscape. How long can they last? How much longer can the Germans hold out before their industry is overwhelmed, their tanks outnumbered, and their soldiers exhausted? The war had entered a new phase, one that Germany was not equipped to fight. June 5th, 1943, near Kursk, Soviet Union. The sun blazes down over the desolate plains, casting long shadows over the twisted wrecks of tanks and vehicles. The Germans have prepared for this moment, an attempt to reclaim momentum in the battle against the Soviets. But as the roar of Soviet artillery fills the air and the rumbling of tank treads grows louder, it becomes painfully clear that this is no ordinary battle. This is not just another Soviet offensive, it's the culmination of a larger, industrial war that the Germans cannot hope to win. The M4 Sherman tanks, now a constant presence on the battlefield, cut through the German defenses like a knife through butter. The Germans had hoped that their own tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, could slow the Soviet advance, but the constant pressure of Soviet infantry, artillery, and the unyielding supply of American tanks proves too much. General von Manstein watches from his command post as the Soviet forces surge forward, and he knows deep down that this battle, this moment, marks the beginning of the end. For Lieutenant Müller, the realization is just as grim. His unit has already suffered severe losses in the previous weeks, and the German forces have had to abandon several strategic positions due to the overwhelming presence of American tanks in Soviet hands. As he looks out at the advancing Soviet forces, with their M4 Shermans leading the charge, he understands that it is no longer about tactical brilliance or superior technology. It is about raw, unrelenting, industrial power. The Germans had underestimated the scale of America's involvement in the war. Initially, they thought that Lend-Lease was just a trickle, an occasional shipment of supplies to the Soviets and the British. But now, the full weight of American production is being felt. Every day, more M4 Shermans roll off assembly lines, flooding the Eastern Front. The Germans, despite their technological advancements, simply cannot keep up. Their factories, under constant bombardment, are slow to repair and restock, while American factories churn out tanks at a pace that seems inexhaustible. The M4 Sherman, with its relatively simple design, has proven to be a perfect weapon for a war of attrition. It's not as heavily armored as the Tiger I, and its firepower doesn't match the Panther's long-barreled 75mm gun, but it doesn't need to. The Sherman's true strength lies in its sheer numbers. Its design allows for rapid production and repair in the field. When one is destroyed, it is replaced almost immediately. This ability to replace losses is something the Germans cannot do. The effect of this overwhelming industrial capacity becomes clear in the thick of battle. As Soviet infantry advance, supported by a steady stream of Shermans, the German lines begin to buckle. Every time the Germans try to regroup and counterattack, the Americans flood the front with more tanks, more infantry, more supplies. It's a cycle the Germans cannot break. In the heart of the battle, Major Kessler, now commanding the remnants of his unit, feels the weight of his orders. The German forces are struggling to hold their ground, but it's clear that they can no longer win this fight. The loss of key positions and the sheer number of enemy tanks pushing them back every day is taking its toll on morale. Kessler orders his men to retreat, but as he watches another group of Shermans barrel forward, he knows this retreat is just the beginning of something larger. The Germans are now in a battle they cannot win. It's no longer just about the fight on the ground. It's about America's industrial capacity and its ability to outproduce Germany at every turn. Von Manstein, ever the strategist, understands this truth. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but the reality is undeniable. Germany's military, no matter how skilled or innovative, is being drowned by the unrelenting tide of American production. The turning point in the war has arrived not on the battlefield, but in the factories of the United States. As the M4 Shermans continue to pour into Soviet hands, and as the Germans are forced to withdraw further and further, it becomes painfully clear that the future of the war has shifted. It is no longer about tanks alone. It's about the ability to produce, repair, and replenish those tanks. And the Germans, for all their advanced technology, are helpless against the industrial might of the United States. For Lieutenant Müller, Major Kessler, and every other German soldier on the Eastern Front, the message is clear. The war is no longer just a battle for territory, it's a battle for survival, against a power that can replace losses at a rate they cannot match. The battle for Kursk and the war itself is now a struggle of attrition. The Germans are fighting not only against the Soviets, but against an industrial machine they can never hope to outpace. June 20th, 1943. Near the Dnieper River, Soviet Union. The Germans have retreated, again, from yet another shattered defensive position. The once proud Wehrmacht is now a shadow of its former self, spread thin across the front lines and reeling from the unrelenting onslaught of Soviet forces, bolstered by the ever-growing presence of American tanks. The relentless tide of M4 Shermans has not only inflicted massive losses, but also shattered the myth that Germany could win the war with superior tactics and technology. In a field hospital, Lieutenant Müller looks out from his tent at the ruins of a nearby village. His face is drawn, his uniform smeared with dirt and blood. The constant retreat, the endless days of battle, and the rising casualties have taken their toll. The Americans and Soviets, working in tandem, have pushed the Germans to their breaking point. What was once thought to be a war of innovation where the best tank, the best strategy, or the most elite unit would win, has transformed into a war of numbers, endurance, and logistics. And Germany, despite all its brilliance on the battlefield, has failed to keep pace. Müller recalls a conversation with one of his officers just days earlier, as they watched an endless procession of Shermans advancing toward their position. "It doesn't matter how good we are," his officer had said with a bitter laugh. "We're just one army against the entire American industrial machine." The stark reality is sinking in. The Germans are not fighting against the Soviets alone. They are fighting against the inexhaustible power of American production. Every time a Sherman is destroyed, two more appear in its place. The tanks seem to materialize out of nowhere, like an unstoppable wave crashing against a fractured dam. Even the superior German tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, are beginning to feel the strain. They may be better equipped for battle, but there are simply not enough of them. The production lines in Germany are no match for the endless supply of Shermans pouring out of American factories. Meanwhile, the Soviets, now well equipped with a steady stream of Lend-Lease tanks, have shifted their strategy. The Soviet forces, once relying on sheer numbers and poorly equipped tanks, are now able to combine their own tactical expertise with the firepower and reliability of American machines. The once feared Panzer divisions now find themselves overwhelmed, outnumbered, and outgunned at nearly every turn. In a meeting of the German High Command, General von Manstein delivers the grim news. The battle for Kursk, the pivotal point of the Eastern Front, has been a failure. The Soviets, with their newly reinforced tank forces, have broken through the German defenses. The Tigers and Panthers that had once been the crown jewels of the German army are now fighting a losing battle, unable to contend with the sheer volume of tanks and artillery the Allies can field. Von Manstein, ever the tactician, knows that Germany cannot afford to continue fighting this war of attrition. The myth of German military superiority, based on technological innovation and tactical brilliance, is collapsing. The war is no longer about individual battles. It is about who can produce the most tanks, aircraft, and supplies, and the Allies are winning that battle, hands down. The Germans had prided themselves on their ability to adapt quickly and outsmart their enemies. But against the relentless flow of American-produced tanks, no amount of ingenuity can turn the tide. For Major Kessler, the collapse of this myth is personal. He's watched as his comrades have fought bravely, giving everything they have to hold their positions, but now the truth is undeniable. The Germans have lost their advantage. The superiority of the American industrial machine has crushed their hopes for victory. The war is no longer about military tactics, it is about industrial might, and the Germans are being outproduced at every turn. Even as he considers the possibility of a total German collapse, Kessler knows that this is a turning point. The myth that Germany could win the war with better technology, superior tactics, and elite forces is dead. The Allies have proven that sheer numbers, supported by industrial strength, can outlast any tactical brilliance. The Soviets are not the only threat. Now, the Americans, with their factories churning out tanks and equipment in unimaginable quantities, have made it clear that they are fighting a war on an entirely different scale. Müller, sitting alone in the aftermath of another failed defense, feels the weight of the moment. He thinks back to the beginning of the war when Germany was on the offensive, and their tanks were the envy of the world. Now, they are in retreat, fighting an enemy that cannot be defeated through superior tactics alone. The Germans have been outproduced, and as the sun sets on another day of failed resistance, Müller knows that the war's outcome is no longer in doubt. The myth of German superiority has collapsed. The Allies, led by the unyielding industrial power of the United States, have won the war of attrition, and with it, the Germans' hope of victory fades further into the distance. July 15th, 1943. Eastern Front, near the Dnieper River. The battlefield is now a scene of utter chaos. The German forces, exhausted from months of fighting and retreat, are barely holding on. The M4 Shermans, now a fixture in the Soviet ranks, continue to roll across the battlefield like an unstoppable tide. Their guns roar with every engagement, and their steady march pushes the German lines further and further back. Lieutenant Müller surveys the battlefield from a ruined farmhouse, his face grim as he watches another wave of Shermans advance. In the distance, the smoke of burning German tanks rises into the air, a stark reminder of their inability to match the sheer volume of American firepower. The German soldiers, already worn thin by the constant pressure of Soviet artillery and infantry assaults, are now forced to face a new kind of enemy, one they cannot defeat with tactics or superior technology. They are facing an industrial juggernaut that is churning out tanks and supplies faster than they can destroy them. The situation is dire. The Germans, despite their best efforts, can no longer hold their ground. Each retreat brings them closer to collapse, and each new engagement with the Shermans feels like a death sentence. The American tanks have proven to be not just an asset to the Soviet forces, but a symbol of the unrelenting industrial strength of the United States. As Müller watches another Sherman roll forward, the weight of the situation presses down on him. The Germans, no matter how skilled or determined, simply cannot win this war of attrition. In the high command, General von Manstein is forced to confront the truth that Müller and his men already know. The war has changed in ways they never anticipated. It is no longer a battle of maneuvering tanks or clever tactics. It is a battle of production. The Germans can no longer compete with the industrial might of the United States. No matter how many tanks they produce, no matter how many men they send to the front lines, they cannot match the relentless supply chain that the Allies have established. The battle for Kursk, once hoped to be the turning point, has become the beginning of Germany's unraveling. Von Manstein addresses his officers, his voice heavy with the burden of the truth. "We are not fighting a war of tanks anymore," he says quietly, his eyes scanning the faces of his commanders. "We are fighting a war of production." And in that war, we are losing. The German officers nod in grim understanding. They have seen the shift in the battlefield, felt the pressure of the American industrial machine bearing down on them. They had always believed in their ability to outfight any enemy, to outthink any adversary. But now, the battle has changed. It is not about who has the better tanks or the more skilled soldiers. It is about who can maintain the flow of resources. And the Germans, already exhausted from years of warfare and facing the relentless bombardment of Allied forces, cannot keep up. For Major Kessler, the realization is bitter and final. He has fought bravely, led his men through countless engagements, but now, in the face of this industrial behemoth, he understands that their efforts have been in vain. The war is no longer about tactics, about outmaneuvering the enemy. It's about who can outproduce and outlast. And the United States has made it clear that they are winning that battle. As the sun sets over the battlefield, casting a reddish glow over the smoldering wrecks of German tanks, Müller and Kessler both know the truth. They are on the losing side of history. The myth of German superiority has crumbled, replaced by the harsh reality of war fought with industrial strength. The Soviets, with their newfound power, continue their advance, and the Germans have no answers left. The war, once a battle of innovation and tactical brilliance, has become a struggle for survival against an enemy that cannot be defeated with tanks alone. The final realization comes not in a single battle, but in the cumulative weight of every defeat, every retreat, and every failed attempt to hold back the tide. The Germans, no longer able to rely on their technological superiority, are now caught in a war they cannot win. The Allied industrial machine, led by the United States, has proven to be the deciding factor in the conflict, and the Germans are powerless to stop it. For Müller, Kessler, and the men fighting on the front lines, the war is no longer about individual battles. It is about the inevitable collapse of the German war effort under the overwhelming force of American production. The Germans may have been masters of technology, but in the end, it was the Allies' ability to produce, replenish, and overwhelm that won the war. August 1st, 1943. The Eastern Front, now a ghost of its former self, is littered with the remnants of battles fought and lost. The land is scarred by the passage of war, burnt-out tanks, shattered artillery pieces, and trenches that have long since been abandoned by the soldiers who once held them. The once proud German Panzer divisions, symbols of military might and innovation, are now retreating in disarray, their soldiers demoralized and their vehicles barely functional. Lieutenant Müller, one of the few survivors from his unit, surveys the scene with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. The fields around him are quiet now, but the echoes of battle still linger in the smoke-filled air. He has seen the tide of war change in a way he could never have imagined when the conflict began. The myth of German technological superiority, once so firmly entrenched in the minds of its soldiers, has been shattered by the industrial might of the United States. The Soviet forces, now with a steady flow of American-supplied M4 Shermans and other Lend-Lease equipment, are pushing forward with relentless determination. They are no longer the poorly equipped and poorly trained forces they once were. With American tanks, artillery, and trucks fueling their advance, the Soviets are closing in on Berlin. Their push is unstoppable. What was once a dream of a decisive German victory is now a nightmare of defeat and destruction. The Soviet forces are not just fighting with Soviet might, they are fighting with American strength behind them. In Berlin, the German High Command has shifted from tactics to damage control. General von Manstein, who once saw himself as the master of battlefield strategy, now watches helplessly as the German war effort collapses. No amount of tactical brilliance, no number of advanced tanks or aircraft can overcome the sheer volume of material the United States has poured into the war. The war of attrition has reached its breaking point for Germany, and there is no turning back. For Major Kessler, the retreat is no longer about survival. It is about witnessing the end of an era. Germany, the nation that had once held Europe in its grip, is now fractured, its military broken. The defeat in the East, compounded by the relentless Allied bombing of German industrial centers, is signaling the beginning of the end. The myth of German supremacy, built on technological innovation and tactical genius, has crumbled under the weight of an industrial machine that outproduced and overwhelmed the Wehrmacht at every turn. As the Germans retreat, their soldiers begin to understand the scale of what has been lost. For years, They had fought with the belief that superior technology would win the day, that the ingenuity of the Tiger I and Panther tanks, the sophisticated tactics, and the skilled officers would carry them to victory. But now, in the wake of overwhelming industrial force, they realized that the war was never about individual tanks or soldiers. It was about who could outlast whom, who could keep producing weapons and supplies, and who could continue the fight when all seemed lost. And the Germans, despite their best efforts, were outmatched in this war of resources. In the aftermath of the war, as Europe begins to rebuild, the legacy of the Lend-Lease program and the overwhelming industrial production of the United States is unmistakable. Historians and military analysts look back on the conflict and recognize that it was not just the battles or the strategies that decided the war. It was the factories of Detroit, the assembly lines in the United States, and the unrelenting production of tanks, planes, and supplies that made the difference. The M4 Sherman, once dismissed as an imperfect tank by German officers, emerges as a symbol of American industrial power. It wasn't the most advanced tank on the battlefield, but it was produced in vast quantities, repaired in the field, and sent back into combat without fail. The German military, despite its advanced technology and superior engineering, could not match the sheer quantity of tanks being supplied to the Soviet forces. In the end, the industrial might of the United States proved to be the deciding factor, changing the course of the war and ensuring Allied victory. Lieutenant Müller and Major Kessler, like many others who survived the war, are left to ponder the significance of their defeat. They had fought valiantly, relying on the superiority of their weapons and tactics, but in the end, it was not the quality of their tanks or their soldiers that mattered. It was the quantity of tanks and soldiers that the Allies could bring to bear, the unyielding flow of material from American factories that broke the back of the German war effort. As the world begins to recover and rebuild in the post-war years, the legacy of America's industrial power will continue to shape global politics and military strategy. The Germans may have been defeated on the battlefield, but the war itself was won by the machines of industry, by the unrelenting power of the American war machine.